So, hello and welcome. It is Tuesday, which means it's time for a little how-to. This actually, to be perfectly honest, is a re-record. I was not happy with my original video because of my execution of the technique wasn't great, and I couldn't figure out what it was that I wasn't doing right, and I did. So I decided this one time I would redo the video, which is, I never do that. So I'll tell you what it was. It was my tension was off, which is why I was having such trouble. So I'm back to do another knitting style video, and if you'd like to know more about what that is, what I'm talking about, and so on and so forth, stay tuned. I'm Aradia. I am the resident witch and creatrix over at Aradia's Hand of Danae's Divine, where I create myth, magic, and meaning for your everyday life through art, intuition, and energy work. And since it's Tuesday, I thought I would take the time to do a little how-to video. So one of my earlier videos, you see me knitting continental, and continental is the style of knitting that I'm used to, and it is the style of knitting I would say I've probably done the entire time I've been knitting. And so I'm very practiced at it, and look like I know what I'm doing. This style of knitting, American knitting, also called English, or I think in Japan they call it French. This I am much less adept at, to the point of being inept, actually. Now, the reason to use one knitting style over another really is preference. If you want to knit a certain way, knit a certain way. If you want to hold your needles or your yarn a certain way, do it. I don't really think that there's a right or way wrong to work as long as you make stitches. Now, there will be differences in tension and the fabric and your gauge, and some ways may be more or less difficult for you, and that matters. But outside of that, it really doesn't matter. So one thing I will say is some people feel that continental is faster than American or English knitting, and I think part of that is because of the hand movements that are involved with one that aren't involved with the other. But I would argue that that's really relative, because if you are practiced at something, you're probably going to be faster at it than if you're not. So there's that. Anyway, what you'll need is yarn and needles. And here we go. So probably the most important thing when you're knitting is keeping your tension. If you don't keep your tension well, then what's going to happen is your yarn's going to slide all over the place, and your fabric's going to be really loose. So when you knit English style, it's called throwing, and it's called throwing because of how you get the working yarn around the needle, versus continental is called picking, and it's because a lot of people pick with the needle. So I'm going to get that out of the way. And in my previous video, which I will not that is okay. Whoa. My previous knitting video, the fabric was really loosey-goosey, and that was because I wasn't holding tension. So one of the things I would say is, if you're going to switch up your knitting styles, you should definitely practice something simple like this, like a square, and get your tension how you'd like it, because it'll make your fabric a lot better. And this cast on is a little tight, which would make any knitting difficult. I just kind of whipped the casting on there, the cast on there. And as you can see why people think this is slower, and it's because you quite literally are taking your hands off the needles, or your hand off the needles. And that is going to, that extra movement, it does take time. And that's something to consider. Now I will say I did a few practiced rounds or rows, and the first one I think for me is the hardest. I don't have a lot in the way of anything to hold on to, and so that's where some of the trouble is. And I was trying to hold my tension a specific way, and it was not working. It was becoming too loose. So that's another thing to consider. When you're holding your tension, you know, some people will hold it a specific way. When I was seeing someone do it, they did it like that. And that was all fine and good, but I couldn't keep the tension taut enough doing that myself. So I started doing this instead. And this, around my middle finger, gave me a good deal more control. And, you know, it's not so much where you hold your tension as the style is where you're holding your yarn and your dominant hand versus your non-dominant hand. And by the way, when they say dominant and non-dominant, they are assuming that you're right-handed, which is terrible, because if you're left-handed, you know, clearly that's not your dominant hand, right? But that's the thing. And of course, I've made a bunch of videos on not just these two knitting styles, continental and English. I've also made several videos on different knitting methods, which are Eastern, Western, combination, and then my version of combination, which is a mite different. I feel that, you know, however you're comfortable is the right way to knit. But if you're having trouble, or if you don't like how fast you're knitting, or you would like to, you know, give your hands a break, it's definitely worth learning a new style. I would say I wouldn't recommend switching styles in the middle of a project, because the likelihood is your tension is going to be a little off, and that's going to be evident in your finished product, so you don't want to do that. So now we've got something forming. You can see how right now the fabric looks a little loosey-goosey, which is more than likely all me. Nothing little to do with the technique, and more to do with my lack of experience doing it. So we're going to do 2 more rows so you can see what it looks like. Good thing is I haven't tried to knit my tail yet. That's pretty good. We've got one more row that we're going to do. And try to keep my tension close to the work. I found that for me that works a little better, because then it's not as loose and I have more control over what the yarn is doing. Alright, so here we go. Alright, so we've got 4 rows done. You can see that the fabric is a little loose. It's not as neat as my Continental is. It's not as loose as it could be, and I think with a lot more practice it would be a little more even. But you've seen the difference between Continental and now English, and I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Is there a style of knitting that you prefer? There are other styles of knitting beyond just English and Continental. Those are just the main 2 people think of. Have you tried any of those others? Would you think of this and the other, of course? And then did you have any suggestions of videos that you'd like to see? I'd love to hear from you. You can comment below. So thanks for joining me on this How To Tuesday. And I will see you again. Bye.